Hey guys, welcome to the video about evidence for evolution. I hope you're taking notes on this video. You can also read the textbook. I posted the pages for evidence for evolution on Google Classroom, so if you'd rather not listen to me talk, which I don't blame you, you can just read those pages as well. So first important thing to point out is that evolution is a theory, and what a theory means in science is that it is a well-supported, testable explanation of phenomena that have occurred in the natural world. There's a lot of evidence to support the theory of evolution, and those pieces of evidence is what we're going to look at today. First piece of evidence we're going to look at is fossil evidence. A fossil is a trace of an animal or plant of the past that has been preserved in rock for a really long time. Not every dead organism turns into a fossil. Most things, when they die, they get decomposed or eaten by other organisms, but what happens is when something dies and then either mud covers it or sand covers it, and that gets packed down over a long period of time and covered up with more dirt over years and years and years, that's when it gets preserved into a fossil. Fossils are also evidence that the Earth is very old, about 4 billion years old to be precise, which is further evidence for the theory of evolution. Organisms change over time. If you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see horses millions of years ago were very small. The ancestors of horses were small. They didn't have hooves yet. And then slowly over time, we can see the transitional species as the organisms are getting larger and larger. The toes are getting closer and closer together to form that hoof instead of having toes. The jaw is getting larger. So you can see the organisms are changing over time. If the Earth wasn't old, then we wouldn't be able to see these fossils from millions of years ago. So that evidence supports itself. Also, if you look at those whale fossils, did you know that whales, the ancestors, walked on land? Which is why whales are mammals. They breathe air. They're not fish. And they evolved from land mammals millions of years ago. And we'll do an activity on that probably next week, so you can look more, because I think that's super cool. Scientists can document the fact that life on Earth has changed over time by comparing fossils found in older rocks with fossils found in newer rocks. So you can see in this picture the fossils that are closer to the surface are newer organisms that lived more recently, and the deeper down you go, obviously, the longer that organism, oh my God. The deeper the organism, the older the organism, is what I was trying to say. Now think for a second. How can we figure out if two humans are closely related or not? If someone is really your sibling or not? What kind of tests would they do? Probably a DNA test, right? Scientists do the same thing for organisms to see how closely related they are, to see if a tiger and a lion are both closely related, or if a tiger is more closely related to a house cat. We would do a DNA test and compare to see how much DNA those organisms have in common, just like we would do to see if two humans are closely related. If they have a lot of DNA in common, that means they're more closely related. And that brings us to our second piece of evidence for evolution, which is molecular evidence. The molecules that we're talking about here are DNA, and we already know that DNA codes for proteins. So this image is showing amino acids, which are proteins. So we could look for proteins that they have in common. DNA, some look for RNA. Any of those things are molecular evidence for evolution. Closely related organisms have similar DNA sequences. So scientists can compare DNA sequences to see which organisms are more closely related. The fewer the differences there are between the sequences of organisms, the more closely related they are to one another. So if you look at that image on the slide, which compares amino acids in a protein called cytochrome C, which is found in all organisms, if we're comparing to chimpanzees, those numbers are representing the number of differences, those numbers are differences from humans. Okay, so chimpanzees have no differences from humans, so we can assume that chimpanzees are very closely related to humans since they have the same exact number of amino acids as humans for cytochrome C. Rhesus monkeys have one difference, so they're closely related to humans, but not as close as chimpanzees. Rabbits have 9 differences, cows have 10, pigeons have 12. So you can see the more differences, the more distantly related we are. The fewer differences, the more closely related we are. And the third piece of evidence is comparative anatomy. So scientists can look at particular structure of modern day animals to see the similarities and differences among them. Similarities would suggest that at one point the organisms have a common ancestor. So the more similar, the more recent the common ancestor, and the more different, the more distant that common ancestor would be. So if you're looking at these leg bones, so we have leg bones in this image of all different organisms, man, monkey, dog, sheep, horse. They all have the same bones, right? That top bone is the same in all. It might be a different shape, but it's still the same bone. That's called a femur. The bones below that are the tibia and fibula. All of these organisms have those same bones, even though they're shaped differently. So we can tell that all these organisms do have a common ancestor, but the more recent common ancestor are the ones that are more closely related. You can see the sheep and the horse look more similar to each other, so those are going to be more closely related than a horse and a man. The man and the monkey are more similar than the man and the horse, for example. Those similar structures are called homologous structures. If you remember, homo means same, so these are the same structures. So similar structures shared by related species that are inherited from a common ancestor. So these show that these organisms are closely related. Homologous structures. They have the same basic form, but have evolved to have different functions. Same form, different function. So again, homo means same. So they have the same structures, for example, bones, but they've evolved to have different functions. So if you look at this picture, right, the human, the cat, the whale, the bat, they're all mammals. They all have the same bones, humerus, radius, ulna, carpals, right? They're colored the same in all the organisms, even though they have a different shape. So for example, humans' arms are used to grasp things, so they need long fingers, whereas a bat uses its arm to fly. So those long fingers are specific to the function of the wing of the bat. Same for the whale. They have the same bones. You can see the colors. They're the same bones, even though they're a different shape. They just have a different form, or because they have different functions, right? So they're shaped a little differently because they have a different function. Whales use their arm for swimming. Humans use their arm for grasping. So just to reiterate, homologous structures show that organisms descended from a common ancestor and thus support the idea of descent with modification. So we've all descended from a common ancestor with modification as time went by. The more alike the homologous structures are, the more closely related the organisms are. Now, the opposite of a homologous structure is an analogous structure, kind of like an analogy in English class. Analogous structures are similar structures in different species that are not evolved from a common ancestor. These structures have the same function, but different structures. So for example, if you look at the image to the right, you've got a bat wing, a bird wing, and an insect wing. They're all wings, so they have the same function, which is to fly, but they've got different structures. So if you look at the bat and the bird, they have bones, whereas the insect does not have bones. They have an exoskeleton with membranes in between. So even though they're used for flying, the same function, they do not have the same structure, which means they do not have a recent common ancestor. So they are not closely related to each other. Now, all of these species evolved similar adaptations to help them survive in their environment, right? So they're all used for flying, even though they aren't made of the same structures. Okay, so that's important to understand. They're adaptations that help them survive in a similar environment, which is why they have similar characteristics. Another word that's used when we talk about comparing anatomy in terms of evidence for evolution is vestigial structures, which you might have heard before. Vestigial structures are inherited structures, so they're passed down from one generation to the next, inherited, that no longer serve a useful function to the species. These structures were useful to an ancestor, but not to the modern organism. So for example, a tailbone in a human. Our ancestors had tails, lived in trees, but we no longer need those tails. We don't have tails, but we still have a tailbone, which is attached to our pelvis. A pelvic bone in whales. This is further evidence that whales evolved from land organisms that had legs. So whales did once have legs. Their ancestors had legs, which is why they still have a pelvis. But since that pelvis isn't harming them, it was never evolved away from. So it doesn't cause them any harm, meaning if a whale is born with a pelvis, it's not any less likely to survive than if a whale was born with a mutation where they didn't have a pelvis. So those vestigial structures were just passed from one generation to the next, even though they don't have a use in the modern species. Comparing embryos, or embryology, is another way that scientists can compare the anatomy of organisms. Embryology is the study of the development of embryos, which are the early stages of living things. Comparisons of these early stages of different vertebrates, and a vertebrate is just an animal that has a backbone, or vertebrae, show similarities. So this suggests that they have a common ancestor. So if you look at this picture, we have the fish, reptile, bird, human. In these early embryonic stages, you can't tell which one is which. They all have similar features. You can see their vertebrae going down their backbone. You can see they all have a tail. They all have gill slits. They have little eye spots, little ear spots that are developing. They have limb buds. Those will eventually, as that embryo develops, turn into arms or legs, lungs, whatever this organism is turning into. But in those early stages, they look similar. The more similar they look at these early stages, the more closely related they are. Again, the more similar the embryology is of different organisms, the closer their evolutionary relationship is. So I've got some more organisms here in this image, and if you look along the top, all of those embryos look almost exactly the same. We've got fish, salamander, tortoise, chicken, pig, cat, rabbit, human. You can't tell them apart at that stage. At that second stage, the one in the middle, you can start to see some changes, especially the fish and the salamander. The fish looks very different from the human at this phase. So that shows us that the fish and the human do not have a recent common ancestor. Whereas all of the mammals, so the pig, the cat, the rabbit, the human, those you still can't tell which one is which at those early stages. It's not until the final stage that you can actually start to tell those organisms apart. So we can tell that those organisms are more closely related than, let's say, the human and the fish, or the rabbit and the turtle. So that's it for evidence of evolution. Oops, I spelled something wrong, of course. So what you're going to do now is use those notes and complete the evidence for evolution practice questions, which are in Google Classroom. Submit them when you're complete. If you need to go back to the video, please do so. You can also use the textbook if there was something that I didn't explain quite well. You can read more about it in your textbook. If you have questions, feel free to email me, or you can ask during our next Zoom meeting. I'm happy to explain some more. I hope this was helpful. I miss seeing you in my classroom, and I hope we get back there soon. Stay well. Bye.